In this section, what we're going to be talking about is modern JavaScript. So we're going to take a look at all the awesome new features, or most of the awesome new features that we can start using today. And I'm going to show you guys how we can take advantage of these awesome new features and still have browser compatibility with older browsers, and even browsers that just don't have these features implemented whatsoever. So yeah, we'll talk about that. I highly encourage everybody to start taking advantage of these features and stuff and things. I think they'll speak for themselves once we start talking about them. If you hopped right into the section and you're not interested in all the stuff we talked about before with Node, I recommend you go back and you take a look at two videos that I've done before about some modern JavaScript features, namely arrow functions and template strings. But otherwise, let's go ahead and get started. In this video, I just want to do a quick little bit of history and a little bit of clarification of how JavaScript is versioned and how to interpret the way that people describe it and talk about it, and how the standardization process goes, and how to know which browsers support which features and what things are safe to use and so on. So I guess I'll start off with a little bit of history. You can read all about it on this wiki page. I'll just summarize it really quickly here. Basically, Netscape browser, back a long time ago, in the 90s, needed a scripting language. Back then, there was no scripting language available for client-side development. So they wanted to put together this little language. So they got a guy to go out and build a language. And because of some marketing madness, they wanted it to have the word Java in its name, even though JavaScript and Java have practically nothing in common whatsoever. So JavaScript was made, and it was implemented in Netscape. But obviously Microsoft had to catch up. You remember, this was the Netscape Internet Explorer war that was going on. So Microsoft wrote their own engine called JScript. And at this time, nothing was standardized at all, and it was really a nightmare to work with JavaScript and do client-side scripting. So what happened was ECMA, which is a body responsible for standardizing stuff, went out and actually wrote a standard for JavaScript, and they called it ECMAScript. So ECMAScript is the standard of which JavaScript is based off of. And it's not the only language that is based off of ECMAScript. For example, ActionScript. In fact, you can see it right here. ActionScript and QTScript and InScript. Those are other implementations of ECMAScript. But generally, when we say ECMAScript, we're referring to JavaScript. And because of the way that the versioning works, we'll often whenever somebody talks about JavaScript as a language and writing JavaScript where the version isn't important, we'll often just say JavaScript. But if we're talking specifically about a version of JavaScript and what features may or may not be available, we'll refer to it as ECMAScript. And currently, the current version of ECMAScript is the sixth edition, and I've already said ECMAScript 6 quite a few times in this series to describe a version of JavaScript that has newer features than one might be used to. So, however, when we talk about the versioning of JavaScript, so we might say ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 7. It's actually become more common these days to refer to the ECMAScript specification depending on what version or what year we're talking about. So now ECMAScript 6, or shortened to ES6, is now known as ECMAScript 2015 or ES2015, and you'll see those terms used interchangeably. So anyway, to sum up, if we're talking about the language generally, what we're going to write on the browser, we'll just say JavaScript if the version doesn't matter. If we're specifically referencing a version of JavaScript, we will say ECMAScript, followed by the for the older versions, we'll say ECMAScript 4 or ECMAScript 5. For the current version and future versions, we're going to refer to them by their year, so ECMAScript 2015. Now, I've said ES6 and ECMAScript 6 so often that sometimes I'll slip up and not refer to it as ECMAScript 2015, but you should really get that in your head that ECMAScript 2015 is the version that we're going to be using. So I just wanted to avoid any potential confusion, because you'll see all these terms thrown around all the time, and it can get really confusing if you don't understand the standards body behind it or the history behind it. we're never going to refer to JavaScript by its version. We're not going to say JavaScript version 1.6 or 1.8 or 2 or whatever, because from what the perspective we care about from a programmer, from the perspective of a programmer, we only care about the version of the specification that's currently being used on the browser that we're targeting, or the browsers that we're targeting. So now let's talk about ES2015. So ES2015 is a version that has a very wide support in modern browsers, and if you use a special program called a transpiler, you can make ES2015 code run on practically any browser that you might expect to be running on. So we'll be talking about all the features, all the important features, the features that I personally find really important over the course of this section. But if you're interested in actually reading further about this, there is a page over here. It's a GitHub page. It's under TC39. TC39 is the group within within ECMA that actually does the ECMAScript specification, and it's under ECMA 262. And they have a nice little table that talks about what specific in progress features that you might want to be aware of. So these are features that we're not going to be really talking about any of these features, but if you're interested in looking at what the current status of ES2015 or ES2016 will be, this is a good place to start. I'll point out what these stages mean. The stages is basically the maturity of the proposal. So, for example, a 1 is simply a proposal of a feature, saying, hey, I think this would be really cool, here are some examples, blah, blah, blah. A stage 2 feature is a draft, and a draft is, okay, so it got accepted by the committee, and they're like, okay, that's a cool feature, but now why don't you go and you flesh it out and actually give us a language specification for this feature? And that's what 2 is. So during 2, the draft might change a lot. Once we get up to stage 3, then it's a candidate, and there could be still some refinement. So browser vendors who are implementing these features, or may not implement these features, or other people on the committee may want to refine things. But for all intents and purposes, the draft has solidified. And then finally, we have stage 4 features, which stage 4 features are finished and they're ready for inclusion in the next version of ECMAScript. The reason I bring up the stages, though, is because some of these features you can use transpilers for to get working in web browsers and older web browsers that obviously don't have these features. But I wouldn't recommend using any of these, using a transpiler for any of these features unless it's at stage 4 or 3, because if it's on stage 2 or 1, the actual specification might change and your code might break. So some of these, like particularly async functions, for example, that should more or less be fine to use because it's stage 3, and there are already transpilers you can use this feature in the in modern web development if you wanted to. We're not going to be talking about async functions though in this section. This section is all about ECMAScript 2015. Which basically has been completed and is slowly being implemented in browsers. So how do you know which browsers support which features? Well, there's this awesome thing. So again, talking about ECMAScript 2015 is all well and good, but you kind of have to go dig a little bit further into the specification, because some browsers support some features of ECMAScript 2015, some don't. And you can go to this awesome page here. You can see the URL here at the top, and right now I have ECMAScript 6 selected, and we have this nice little list of all of these approved features of the specification, as well as a graph of which browsers support which features, and to what extent that they support those features. It also talks about which transpilers support which features, which is really nice too. That'll come in handy once we start talking about transpilers and getting them set up in our project. If you wanted a preview of ECMAScript 7, or what's probably going to be ECMAScript 2016, you can click the 7 button over here, and you can look at all the awesome stuff that we'll be able to start using probably next year. But yeah, so basically in this section, I'm going to show you guys how we can use these features today, even if your browser doesn't support it. And that's really important, because this is, we want to be able to use modern JavaScript, but we want our code to run on as many environments as possible. So I think I will wrap up this little history lesson. Again, I'm sorry, I know this stuff is boring, but there's so much going on right now and so many different terms flying around that it's important to be able to speak the language to know what people are talking about specifically. But I think that wraps this up, and in the next video, I'm going to show you guys how we can use a transpiler to actually start using most of these features today without having to worry about browser compatibility. So we'll see you guys then.